Thanks for joining us today. My name is John Nelson. I'm the Vice President of Operations at BBI International. With me today is Anna Simet. She is the editor of Biomass Magazine, Pellet Mill Magazine, and Biodiesel Magazine. Our special guest today is Nate Anderson from the U.S. Forest Service. Nate, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, and you'll be speaking in track 1 at the International Biomass Conference and Expo, and that's taking place March 14th through the 16th in Jacksonville, Florida. So we appreciate you being part of the event. It's shaping up to be it's looking really good. So yeah, thanks again. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm excited to be there.
So Anna, do we have a couple questions we want to jump in and?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Nate. Thanks so much for joining us today. I was really excited to see we had a forester on the agenda. And so I think let's just start by, if you want to tell us a little bit about, what interested you in your profession, and then maybe a little about your background and what you do in your current role.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good. So I am a forester, but I'm a special kind of forester within the U.S. Forest Service, and I'm a research forester. So most people are familiar with the Forest Service land management activities. So we manage a lot of national forests and grasslands, and we also have a research branch. So that's where I fit in. And my background was more in ecology and land management and silviculture, forest resources management, more traditional stuff, like management for solid wood products, timber, that sort of thing. And I think what's really exciting about biomass, in 2009, I took a position with the Forest Service that was focused specifically on biomass, bioenergy, biofuels, bioproducts, and how they connect to forests. And as you all know, it's been such a exciting area of research over the last 10 years, in so many different ways. So that's kind of where I work right now.
Okay. I'm really excited about your presentation. Everyone knows we've been experiencing these unprecedented wildfires, and I think just more than ever, there's really this sense of urgency to address this problem. And I've written quite a bit about, this ongoing issue in high hazard fuel projects, kind of focused mostly on California and the programs that they're trying to get projects off the ground, like Biomat, BioRam. And overall, it's just, it's a challenging process, getting this material out of the woods and putting it to use. And the big issue seems to be what your presentation is focused on, and that's, the economics or the cost. And so I was looking at your abstract, and your presentation looks into the potential of using this material for bioenergy feedstock. So can you just tell us a little bit more about what you plan to discuss during your presentation?
Sure. Yeah. And it will be focused mostly on what we call in the Forest Service fuel treatment. So, most of your listeners will probably be familiar with biomass in the forest sector in more traditional supply chains. So thinking about, timber sales, when we sell timber and the wood goes to a mill, there's mill residues, but there's also woody biomass left behind at the log landing that people may collect and use for bioenergy. And fuel treatments are a little bit different. We're looking to go into the forest to thin out a lot of the material that is submergible, that doesn't have high value on the market right now. And the primary purpose of doing that is actually not economic or financial in the sense we're trying to raise revenues. We are actually trying to reduce fire risk to protect a whole bunch of other values. So we can think of, when we do these fuel treatments and we lower the probability of severe fire behavior and loss from wildfire, we protect water, we protect biodiversity, we protect recreation, sometimes things like power lines and infrastructure and carbon on the landscape and things like that. So what my presentation is going to be focused on is how do we think about this financial aspect of these treatments. Obviously, there are market costs. There's a lot of cost associated with getting heavy equipment in the forest to do these treatments. But then how do we integrate all those other values into our thinking as an agency and also as a project developer for a biomass project into the big picture? And so the tool we use for that in this case, in my presentation, is techno-economic analysis paired with a method of valuing a lot of those non-market values. And I can describe that in more detail, or we can move on to something else. Up to you.
Yeah. Hey, John, you got any questions? I usually leave you out.
I do. Well, I actually do have a question. Now, you have, from what I understand, you have your PhD in Forest Resource Management from the State University of New York. Is that correct?
That's right. Their College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse. Yep.
Yeah. So just out of curiosity, what, obviously it may have evolved or was an evolution in your career, but what made you want to go down this path? Were you always interested in the forest and you wanted to help, or what, how did you get to this point or feel this was a career path for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people who go to get a PhD, I think, are gunning for, faculty positions somewhere. And I think one of the interesting things about being a researcher in an agency like the Forest Service, especially in our research and development branch, is, my mandate is to conduct primary research. So I do a lot of that, study design. We go out, we'll deploy a piece of equipment and evaluate it and look at the operations and the supply chain and collect data and publish papers. But one of the things that's so exciting about my job, and one of the things that really got me into it and keeps me in it, is the opportunity to make impact by getting out there, doing more extension, education, outreach, cutting across all these different stakeholders. So obviously the industry stakeholders we have in this bioenergy sector are really important, but we have, environmental NGOs that I work with, communities, even with county commissioners and elected officials and other land management agencies. We have a state and private branch of the agency of the Forest Service that provides technical assistance to private landowners and states. We have an international programs branch that I've worked with that it goes global. So these biomass issues and the technical assistance can go global. And so that's a really exciting part of my job, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting from a standpoint of you're educating. You need to educate these communities and the general public, because there's always this idea of, hey, you're tearing down our forests, and you're saying, no, we're managing the forest, we're thinning it so it's in better shape, and just making sure people understand that, of what that means and how it creates a healthier environment and healthier forest. Just it needs to happen. So and I think it's a two-way street too. There's a lot. I do a ton of presentations around the country on this issue. The kind of this nexus between forest management, especially for not timber necessarily, but fuel treatment and forest restoration. We do a lot of forest restoration. This nexus between that and this downstream use of the biomass that we produce, compared to open burning for disposal, which is the common practice in the West, where we're just burning it in piles. And there's really a good give and take there. It's not just, purely one-way information flow. A lot of communities, it's really useful for me to get a perspective on what communities are interested in, or what they have anxiety about, or, what they're thinking in terms of what's best for their community. But then on the industry side, same thing. For me to go to a conference like this one and be able to interact and network with industry people who can say, hey, I saw your presentation, I liked what you said, but have you thought about doing it this way? Or you forgot about this. That's just so valuable to me. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So interesting. Nate, so one more question about your presentation before we move on to our fun and final question. It looks like, you studied some options. Is there any one that kind of stands out in terms of potential bioenergy? You look like biofuels, bioproducts, heat and power, or does it kind of vary given each scenario?
Yeah, I think it varies given each scenario. And, I'm a research scientist, so I always talk in, probabilities, right? So not absolutes.
Right.
And so I think there's a tendency for people to put things head to head like a horse race, like which of these 5 options is the winner. And that's not just for projects, but also for biomass, right? So it's like, forest biomass is better than willow or switchgrass or something else, and it's really not that kind of thing. What we look at in these studies, and what people who go to the presentation will see, is what we're really trying to do is look at different scenarios for projects, and what I'll be sharing is very project oriented. So we take a detailed engineering specification for a very specific project in a specific location, and we pair it with cost benefit analysis, financial analysis, and then we pair it with non-market analysis of the other values. And what we're really looking for is, when is this option a really good idea? What are the conditions under which this is a win-win-win? What are the conditions under which, this is kind of on the bubble, it's kind of this gray area? And what are the conditions under which this idea is a real stinker? And so that has to do with scale. It has to do with, what's your biomass cost, your biomass source. Sometimes it has to do with carbon and your carbon balance. And so I think we're excited about the projects that I'll talk about will cover the full spectrum. So, biochar, biofuels, biopower, even just smaller scale institutional heating systems. That's something our agency, through a variety of programs, including grant programs for communities, has been interested in. And then innovation in products that nobody's ever heard of. That's really exciting. So yeah, I think it's like the full menu from a real kind of applied scenario driven approach.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sounds great. Can't wait for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
me too.
so as John kind of pointed out, a lot of times the biomass industry hears from organizations who are very vocal in terms of using trees. Obviously, biomass energy needs to be done responsibly. So I'm just wondering, fact or myth, more trees are being harvested than they are growing back in the U.S., or is it the opposite? Because I find like that's a constant argument. And from what my research is, there are more trees now than there have been. What's your perspective?
So I think there's 2 different ways you could look at that. But, right, one is local, right? It doesn't matter if we have net forest carbon sequestration at the national level if where you live is experiencing deforestation due to development, for example, where we have land conversion from a forested state to a non-forested state where you're building condos, right? So for somebody who sees that, really the issues are local, they're important, and people get fired up, right? But at the same time, we can think about the United States as a whole being pretty good at sequestering carbon in our forests. And so tree count is one thing, but we could translate just tree count into, are we as a nation in our forest lands gaining carbon on the landscape and that forested landscape, kind of neutral, where our sink strength is strong in some places and weak in others, or are we losing carbon from our forests, which is like all hands on deck red flag situation, right? At a global level, because we have so much forest land. And so I think there's 2 different issues, and we know that U.S. forests are a strong sink, carbon sink, and where we're looking to increase that through good forest management practices, in industry, looking at how we might monetize carbon benefits associated with forests. And I think biomass has an important role to play in that, both in terms of how we manage our forests for, more trees. And sometimes more trees aren't the answer, right? In the forest, we're trying to manage back to a frequent fire regime. We're actually trying to remove trees and reintroduce fire to keep those forests less dense, that is fewer trees. But if we do that right, we can actually increase the carbon sink strength and have better carbon outcomes if we do that the right way. So I think it's interesting, but I do think that it's pretty widely acknowledged that our forests in the United States are a really important component of the global forest sink.
Wow. That was a great answer. I feel like you could do a feature on that alone. Excellent.
Yeah.
I'll have to send another abstract.
Right.
You will. Yeah. Let's talk after this. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure we could go on and on, but, maybe we'll leave it at that. And I really look forward to your presentation at the conference, Nate. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure our listeners really appreciated the conversation. And
thanks for having
we're
me.
excited to see you.
I'm really excited to be there.
Yeah, we'll see you in Jacksonville. We'll pick this up again in Jacksonville.
Sounds awesome.
Thanks
for the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Bye, all.